Good morning, History 132 students. I hope all is well and everyone is remaining safe. Uh, Today, oh, before I get into the lecture, I've checked your grades from test two. I think only two of you have not completed your test requirements. Uh, if you want to, you need to get in touch with me. Otherwise, you will be failing the course. Uh, I can't imagine leaving an A hanging out there for an F because of lack of effort. Okay, chapter 25. It's entitled Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and New Imperialism. Of course, we've given you a definition of imperialism. It simply means to expand the boundaries of borders and the cultural and influence over another state. Um, Now, we've been talking about the African slave trade uh, before the transatlantic slave trade. That was the trans-Saharan slave trade. And both will continue at the same time. But the trade and social change that was brought to the continent of Africa was very detrimental. Uh, Although the trade did and enslaved Africans was a global phenomenon, the transatlantic trade between Africa and the Americas became the most extensive and significant portion of its existence until 1700 and perhaps beginning 1750. Most Europeans considered the African slave trade a legitimate business activity. After 1775, a broad campaign to abolish slavery developed in Britain and grew into one of the first peaceful mass political movement based on the mobilization of public opinion in British history. And finally, uh, in 1807, Parliament, which is the British Congress, declared the slave trade illegal. Britain then began using its navy to seize slave runners and liberate the captives. The leader of this movement was a man named William Wilberforce. Wilberforce University here in America is named after him. Uh, the Once the British Navy captured the slave ships and their inhabitants, they returned them to Freetown in Sierra Leone, as well as to Liberia. Now, Liberia was established by President James, who was it? I think it's James Madison, and it was a part of the colonization effort of emancipated slaves in America. Liberia. So, the slaves remained high on the sugar and coffee plantation, and demand for slaves to remain high on the sugar and slave plantation in Cuba and Brazil. And therefore, they were the last two countries in the Western Hemisphere to emancipate their African slaves. The United States banned slave importation in January of 1808. From that time on, natural increase in slave having children mainly accounted for the subsequent growth of the African American slave population before the Civil War. I would like to point out to you the last slave ship to land in America was in Mobile Bay. The slave ship Clotilda had a bunch of slaves that had been captured in Benin and brought to the Americas. They outran the British Navy, burned the ship, but this occurred in 1859. There's a lot of research out there on the Clotilda and Africatown The latest release in Zora Neale Hurston book called Barracoon. It's a good read. There's an effort to memorialize these inhabitants, these slaves, or former slaves, because they were only slaves for 2 years. The Civil War starts in 1861, and they was brought to America in 1859. Modern day Pritchard is the home of Africa Town. So, due to this ancient but limited shipment of slaves across the Sahara and from the East African coast into the Indian Ocean and through the Red Sea, it expanded dramatically. Only in the 1860s did this trade begin to decline rapidly. As a result, total slave exports from all regions of sub-Saharan Africa declined only marginally, from 7.4 million in the 18th century to 6.1 million in the 19th century. That's how many people was apprehended and sold as slaves in the world. Abolition failed to achieve that vision that legitimate trade in tropical products would quickly replace illegal slave export. Finally, we need to note that powerful West African rulers and warlords who had benefited from the Atlantic slave trade redirected some of their slave labor into the production of legitimate goods for world market. Let's talk about this for a moment. The Europeans were afraid to go into the inland to capture slaves. White Europeans did not capture the slaves. They were captured by other Africans. The Dahomians, I think in the movie Black Panther, the Amazon warrior. Well, Cudjoe Lewis, one of the captains in the Clotilda, talks about these female warriors coming into his village, killing the old and the young, and marching them to the coast to be sold to the American, to be shipped across the ocean as slaves. So many African kings and benefited from the slave trade. So they were just as guilty as the Europeans or the Americans in proliferating the slave trade. A new group of African merchants also emerged to handle legitimate trade and grew rich from this. West African women actively involved in trade, but the arrival of the Europeans provided new opportunities for them. So many became very wealthy behind this activity. We also see at this time the expansion of Islam into Africa. We know about the Mediterranean coast, the Berbers, Egypt across all the way to Morocco. But now effort was aimed at spreading Islam into sub-Saharan Africa, and they did so with the use of jihad, which means holy war or religious war, against both animist rulers and states they deem corrupt. Now let's talk about animism. Animism is the worship of natural objects. That's most indigent people in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, Native Americans, were animists. They believe they worship the sun, the stars, the moon, the earth, the rivers, the trees, you name it. That's what we mean about animism. So they were targeted by the jihadists. And of course, Islam expanded it into East Africa from 1820 on. Arab merchants and adventurers pressed far into the interior in search of slaves and ivory, and converting and intermarrying with the local elites and establishing Muslim state. Kenya, the Sudan, Tanganyika, Zanzibar, Mozambique are good examples. But by 1870, before Christian missionaries and Western armies began to arrive in force, the Muslims had free reign. They expanded westward into Nigeria, northern Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Ghana, But this ended when the West became interested in the wealth of the most mineral-rich continent on Earth, Africa. And this led to the scramble for Africa. This is between 1880 and 1914. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, and Italy all wanted a piece of this African cake. To do so, Bismarck, the ruler of Germany, that united Germany, called the conference of Berlin, uh, to which Africans were not invited. At the conference, it was established the principle that European claim to African territory had to rest on effective occupation. So if you want to claim African territory, you had to colonize it and occupy it in order to be recognized by other modern states. A nation could establish a colony only if it had effectively taken possession of the territory through signed treaties with local leaders and had begun to develop it economically. The representative of the conference recognized King Leopold ruled of the Congo Free State. Please remember Leopold. Google him. Leopold II. He became very rich, but he also committed genocide on the Congolese, killed millions of Africans, and mutilated many others. Uh, but in addition to developing rules for imperialist competition, participants at the Berlin Conference agreed to care for the native people, morally and materially well-being, bring Christianity and civilization to Africa, and suppress slavery and the slave trade. These rules and agreement was contained in the General Act of the Berlin Conference. In truth, however, their ideal ran a distant second to and were not allowed to interfere with the nation's primary goal of commerce, holding on to their old market and exploiting new ones. The Berlin Conference coincided with the German emergency as a nation state led by Bismarck, and he established protectorate. And so Africa now was open game. Bismarck cooperated with France Jules Ferry against the British. The French expanded into West Africa and formed protectorate on the Congo River. The British began enlarging their West African enslaved and pushed northward from the Cape Colonies and westward from the East African coast. So the British mainly dominated the continent, even though you had the Belgium in the Congo, the French in West Africa, the Germans protectorate, who I can't remember which one, but you can determine who colonized these areas by the language that is spoken today in Africa. But to block the Eastern Sudan by fiercely independent Muslims, they put up a fight. Lord Kitchener at the Battle of Khartoum killed 11,000 Muslim fighters. These are black people, and only 28 Britons. So they introduced dominance in the area. And even today in the Sudan, there's in the north, one is Muslim, in the south, the other is Christian. But the profits from the Congo Free State is unbelievable, and this is what led to the genocide by the Belgians, led by Leopold II. Now, in South Africa in the 19th century, the development is different. In South Africa, a Dutch Cape colony, the Dutch had settled there, and there were about approximately 20,000 free Dutch citizens and 25,000 African slaves, with substantial mixed race community on the northern frontier of the white settlers. They called themselves Afrikaners. They would go to battle against the British for control of South Africa. Now, keep in mind, a king, Shaka Zulu, would play a prominent role in the settlement of South Africa. His armies often destroyed his African enemies and went to war against the British and the Afrikaners. Eventually, he was subdued by the Dutch and British invaders, but only after many hard-fought frontier wars. Shaka Zulu, Google him. But the reason they're fighting in South Africa is because of the incredible rich deposit of gold and diamonds. And who leads the effort? Cecil Rhodes. He went to South Africa to seek his fortune in 1888, and there he formed a company called the De Beers. If you have a diamond, I think I have a few on my ring, it was mostly sold by De Beers. Even today, most diamond comes from Africa, but it's controlled by this one company, DEBEERS. Look it up. He established the colony of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And between 1888 and 1893, Rhodes used missionary to force African chiefs to accept British rule. Now, of course, in the South, just like in the American West, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, we see the advent of Jim Crowism. But in South Africa, we see the system similar to the Jim Crowism practiced in the American South called apartheid. And this would exist all the way up until the 1980s, until Nelson Mandela led the effort to do away with this restricted system based on race called apartheid. It's basically a segregated society. Nelson Mandela, one of my heroes. But between 1880 and 1914, we see the implementing of new imperialism. We see America in the Spanish-American War taking control of Cuba, the Philippines, and the Guam, other Spanish protection. This is what we mean by new imperialism, not only in America, but in Asia also. In Asia, the British tried to dominate China to getting them addicted to opium. This led to the Opium War. This was fought by the Chinese. Eventually, it was settled and the British were given the island of Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is still in the news today. It was recently, in the last 20 years, given back to the Chinese. But look at the Opium War there that determined this. But supposedly, as intended from the Berlin Conference, a civilized mission rationalized the aggressive and racist action by the European and American. They argued they could and should civilize supposedly primitive non-Western people, similar reason they had for the Manifest Destiny and the demise of the Native American culture in the Americas. According to this view, African and Asian would benefit from Western education, modern economy, cities, advanced medicines, and higher living standard. They eventually might be ready for self-government Western democracy. But the European imperialists also argued that imperial government protected colonized people from ethnic warfare, the slave trade within Africa, and other forms of exploitation. Who better explains this than Rudyard Kipling? You've heard that name before. He published a poem called The White Man Burden, and he's most famous for the book Jungle Book. But he was an imperialist, and he claimed that peace and stability under European or American dominion permitted the spread of Christianity, and they set forth many African first real contact with European and American was in mission schools. Some people, such as the Igbos in Nigeria, became highly Christianized. Such success in Black Africa contrasted with the general failure of missionary effort in the Islamic world and in much of Africa. Pepper, come here. Come in. Y'all, excuse my dog. This is Pepper. Say hi. Now, go. Stop. But that was critics of imperialism. One such critic was J.A. Hobbes, who wrote in his Imperialism. Joseph Conrad was another, In the Heart of Darkness. And in Africa and Asia, there was resistance. I've already talked about the Opium War and other things. People, just like in America, there were insurrection and opposition to the intrusion of white domination. But there was also decline in the Ottoman Empire. This empire was prominent. These are the Turks. And it lasted up until the end of World War I. In Egypt, the British continued to dominate, and basically these colonies would exist until after World War II, when the end of colonialism came to an end. But we see a rise in global inequality, but we also see an expansion of global markets. But this will lead to what we call the Great Global Migration. The Great Migration, just last day, people are moving from place to place trying to seek a better life. In the early 18th century, the world population entered a period of rapid growth, and through the 19th and 20th century, it continues. Europe population included Russia at that time, more than doubled during the 19th century from approximately 188 million in 1800 to 432 million by 1900. But most people are on the move, and people are looking for a better way of life. We see the growth of cities. We see people in the South moving to the northern industrial cities in America, basically seeking a better life. By the 1880s, America and Australia was building Great White Walls. Discriminatory laws are designed to keep Asians out. Now, recently we had a killing in Atlanta of Asians. This is nothing new in our history. We can go back and look at the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. That's an example. And many immigration laws were passed in the 19th century all the way through the 20th century to prohibit Asians from coming to America. I don't know what else to tell you except please get to work on your research paper, and we will have your final test on this material I discussed today, and we'll continue to give you a lecture up until the end of the semester. Be blessed, stay safe, and work on your research paper. I will upload the study guide so you can prepare for your next test. Caver out.